The whole room went quiet when my sister smiled and said, "We'll be staying here from now on, Armin. You can take your things." I clapped anyway. They thought the applause was for them. It was for the future I'd already taken. I had learned early, through small humiliations and the soft-steer demands of relatives who called obligation love, that silence can be more dangerous than words. Fury explodes and is often forgiven. Silence calcifies and becomes a scaffold for what comes after. When Zara announced she and Imran would move into my childhood room because it made sense, she spoke with a certainty that had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with entitlement. My parents nodded. Cousins smiled. The house hummed with the cozy murmur of people convinced that family meant they could take whatever was convenient. I smiled with them and left the dinner carrying my coat like a shield and a small matchbox of plans in my head. I am Armin. I am not a loud man. But patience for me was not surrender. It was a careful ledger I kept in private, counting every favor turned into expectation, every loan converted into assumed right. Their appropriations were not dramatic at first. They were slow and polite, a borrowed suit that never returned, a favor that became a recurring request, birthdays absorbed into other people's decor. Each concession I made they accepted as precedent. Each help I gave became, in their grammar, a rule. I had thought that kindness might one day be reciprocated. Those expectations were childish. After the dinner, I sat in my little rented room and opened the first drawer of my mind where I kept inconvenient memories. I wrote them down in a ledger on my phone. Dates, amounts, promises, names. The ledger looked dull and small, the work of a man given to domestic disappointments. But numbers are patient and legal documents are stubborn. While their voices echoed through the house in the form of jubilation over the new nursery Zara was planning, I set about turning the ledger into leverage. Revenge, people imagine, is fiery and simple. They picture dramatic confrontations and midnight confrontations. That is cheap. My revenge would be bureaucratic, slow, and performative in the way institutions are performative. Full of forms, stamps, letters, and municipal hearings. You cannot shout down paperwork. Paperwork has a habit of pretending to be neutral, even while it reshapes the lives that touch it. I started small. I pulled together old family documents and studied the title deeds that people reference but never read. Property that becomes family in conversation is often the property no one has bothered to claim on paper. People like stories more than facts, and a story does not trump a registered deed. I transferred the legal title of a small parcel of family land into my name. It was a parcel no one had considered valuable precisely because it was described in sentimental terms. The family lot, our heritage. The same people who speak loudly about heritage rarely check the registry. Lawyers, on the other hand, do. The first certified letter I sent, announcing the registration, got the expected scoff when Zara flicked the page aside and laughed that perhaps I had finally decided to do something useful with the old plot. She laughed as if the facts were a joke. Her laughter was thin. It did not scatter my plan, it began it. Over the following months I reconnected with quiet professionals I'd once known, an architect who owed me a favor from college, a municipal clerk who liked tea at 9 and could be moved with a respectful envelope, a small NGO that specialized in community renewal projects. I learned to enjoy the slow politics of paperwork. I learned how to make civic language sing like a hymn, mixed-use development, affordable housing, community center, words that sound like sunshine in progress and which, when backed with the right documents, pass through committees and into budgets. Zara and Imran were busy photographing chandeliers and picking baby paints. Their social media flared with before and after photos, hashtags about nesting, and story highlights titled Our Renovation. They were so occupied decorating my old room with their certainty that they never noticed I was building scaffolding in places they rarely looked. Regulatory filings, neighborhood surveys, grant proposals. I became the invisible hand that drafted the municipal proposal no one expected to happen. It required patience, and patience is a talent unnoticed by the impatient. I paid little fees and kept quiet. The planning department likes formality. I fed it with proper applications signed and notarized. When the tentative redevelopment plan was posted for public review, my family read it with disbelief. "They can't do this," Zara cried. "They can't take her home." There was the municipal council and the list of bureaucratic momentum. But the most inconvenient day of all was my name on a title and the set of carefully prepared documents that made redevelopment plausible, moral, and legally tidy. The plan I had sponsored included, inconveniently for some, the demolition and integration of my childhood house parcel into a larger mixed-use development designed to create affordable units and a community center. The language emphasized community need, the kind of moral framing that politicians email to their constituents to win ribbon-cutting photographs. When the project was reassessed by counselors who like to show results before elections, the momentum increased. The press loves spectacle, but it also loves a narrative of progress, and the narrative I'd written, cleverly, with the help of an NGO that packaged it as philanthropy disguised as planning, read well. The first countable victory came as the municipal survey notice that landed like rain, official, bland, large font, and uninteresting. My father muttered about red tape. My mother nervously brewed tea for surveyors, not knowing she was filling a role in a play she could not read. The field supervisor took measurements, and in turn took photographs. When the planning notice came back with its recommendation, the project advanced to broader hearings. Zara and Imran rallied. They produced petitions, old photographs, and neighbors who remembered birthdays and childhood parties. They hired a lawyer who liked dramatic statements and even more dramatic posture. They posted online videos in which Zara's voice trembled but tried to sound fierce. The public tends to divide quickly when emotion is loud and facts are dense. Some cousins signed their names under Zara's petition out of instinct. Others sat on the fence. People prefer to be remembered kindly in family histories rather than to be remembered as the cousin who sided with a sibling in a civic fight. The hearings were public theater. People stood before microphones and spoke of heritage, of memory, of the right to a home. I watched their faces as if studying performances, pride, panic, the practiced indignation of a person who suddenly discovered they had been wronged. I watched my mother cry and felt a sympathetic pain that ached in private. I was not indifferent to their suffering. I was not a monster who delighted in cruelty. I am a man who had his ledger full. Each page in my ledger had a name, a date, an amount, a favor, a word. It was not a hysteric list. It was a record of the slow erosion of my dignity. I had been patient because I loved them, or because I had been raised to be patient, perhaps both. At some point, patience became the currency that others spent without permission. The public hearings began to change because the project looked like something bigger than one family's loss. It promised housing for young people who could not afford the city's rising rents, classrooms for after-school programs, and a community center where elders could meet without paying for a cafe. The media loved those photos. Smiling children in a crowd, planners pointing at blueprints. Politicians loved it because it read well on campaign flyers. Rachel, the NGO coordinator, gave a speech about civic responsibility. The counselor who attended nodded carefully and took a selfie for the local paper. In the game of public opinion, moral framing can be a decisive move. Zara and Imran called me a traitor. You used legal trickery, Imran accused at a kitchen table meeting, making a fist with the kind of showy gesture men use when their narratives fail. You stole our home, my sister wailed. They meant it in the raw, intimate way relatives mean things. They knew how to make betrayal sound like an accusation that will be believed. The village aunt recorded a video and shared it across groups. He betrayed the family, she said to the camera as if performing for a holy jury. My parents read the headlines, saw their son's name in capital letters next to redevelopment controversy, and wept. My mother's sadness pierced me, a blade sharpened by guilt and resolve. I wished for a compromise that would spare them pain. I looked for one, but real compromises require both parties to be willing to share history with honesty. Too often, one side presses until the debt is invisible to them. The legal battle was not immediate domination. It was mediation, adjournments, council letters, and procedural delays. It was a slow, gray warfare of paperwork. The council voted, by a narrow majority, that the redevelopment would go forward in the interest of community welfare. They allocated funds for relocation and insisted on a clause that required a certain percentage of affordable units. Politicians love clauses that look compassionate. The press framed it as a tough but necessary decision. Friends and strangers wrote to me. Some called me an agent of progress. Others called me arrogant. Social media divides are sharp and personal. People make neat stories with heroes and villains. I found it both funny and disconcerting that my complex, administrative action could be repackaged into a viral simplification. Nothing is ever as clean as a hashtag. Zara and Imran accepted relocation funds and moved to a smaller, more modern apartment across town. The move was staged. Cousins came to help, hauled boxes, took photographs, and posted captions about new beginnings. My parents watched from the doorway, as if some private film had ended. My father hugged me in a gesture that was apology and farewell tangled together. My mother's hands trembled as she clapped at the community center opening months later, and in the back of that room I saw how grief becomes public performance. Grief is not only sorrow, it is also the rearrangement of how people will remember one another. In the months after the conduct of the redevelopment began, the site filled with the sounds of construction, concrete mixers, men shouting measurements, the thump of foundations going in. The community center took shape, first as a pile of wood and steel, and then as rooms and windows. I stood at the ribbon cutting and tried to keep my face neutral while cameras zoomed in for the ceremonial smiles politicians adore. They wanted to present a victory that looked tidy. This victory was full of mess, relationships strained, mother's nerves raw, family dinners changed forever. I had wanted not spectacle but restitution, a public form of repair that would reach beyond our household and make a difference for strangers who needed space and support. I kept that intention in the center of everything. It did not make the personal consequences lighter, only more purposeful. After the center opened, it wasn't only about policy. It was about mornings in which kids tucked into a reading program and evenings with pottery classes where a shy teenager learned to wedge clay the way a piano student learns scales. It was about a summer program that fed children when their parents worked 2 jobs. These things felt good and tangible. They also complicated the story because I could not pretend that building the center didn't matter. There were thank you letters, and there were families who came forward and said, plainly, we would have had nowhere if this had not been built. These notes collected in a folder I kept on a shelf marked with a label I did not flaunt, for rainy days. They reminded me why I had taken an action that hurt people who were closely connected to me. They did not remove the guilt, but they colored the ledger with small miracles of their own. Not all the family fractures healed. Some dinners became spaces where a nervous dance of conversational avoidance took center stage. There were holidays in which laughter sounded rehearsed. There were confrontations that ended with closed doors and mobile phones set to silent. My sister wrote a message months after the center opened in a tone that mixed accusation and reach. You changed our lives, she wrote. That sentence could be read as condemnation or as fact. I replied with the truth I could not dress up, that I felt the weight of what I had done and I stood by the principles that had led me. It was not the answer she wanted. She did not send another message that night. Daily life required that I live with the practical outcomes of my decision. I created a foundation, clumsy in name but determined in purpose, the Community Renewal Fund, and it managed a small commercial unit whose lease provided steady income for scholarships and after-school programs. I took little pleasures in watching the pottery class where a boy, who once never left his mother's side, now sat at a wheel and laughed with the instructor when a lump of clay collapsed into a ridiculous shape. That laughter held, for me, the most honest sort of payment for the ledger I had paid in loss. People wrote to the local paper about how the center had changed their lives. The paper ran a Sunday piece with photographs of a center's mural, and my mother clipped it out and pinned it to the refrigerator. She would point to the photo to cousins who visited and say, with a tenderness that still held some reproach, he did something for the neighborhood. Her voice had softened in the way grief does after it is worn through. With time, Zara and I reached a kind of truce. It was not intimacy. It was not the kind of familiarity that includes shoulder taps and late-night confidences. But once a month, perhaps, we met for tea when our parents asked us both to attend a small family function. In those moments there was an exchange of information that was bland and ordinary. Health updates, weather, what the children were learning. Sometimes her eyes would pass mine and flash with memory and hurt. Once, after a holiday meal, she came to me alone on the porch. The moon hung low and she asked quietly, "Do you ever regret the way you did it?" She looked younger than she was in that moment. A small girl learning the rules of the world she'd once imagined as inviolable. I did not lie. "Yes," I said. I regret the pain it caused the people I love. I do not regret that I stopped being taken for granted. She inhaled and let out a breath that sounded like a confetti of old resentments breaking. We stood there, two people who had been closely linked by childhood and now separated by choices that had hardened into policy and paved into concrete. What I discovered the hard way was that justice and love do not always live easily in the same house. One can be argued with facts, and while the other is argued for by the clench of the heart. I had no desire to destroy my family. I only wanted to stop being their default ATM, their first call when money was needed and their last call when gratitude was due. I had wanted a life where my boundaries meant something more than their convenience. To get there, I used the only language that could be irrefutable in the hands of those who had always been more persuasive with relatives than with law. I used paper and policy. It hurt. It healed. It reshaped things in ways that were not entirely human. Years went on. The neighborhood around the redevelopment matured into a place where parents pushed strollers and teenagers painted murals on the community center's back wall. The center became a patchwork of lives. A tax preparer who volunteered every Saturday, an elderly neighbor who taught knitting, kids who learned to read and then to code. The press returned on anniversaries with stories about how urban renewal had remade that block. They interviewed people who benefited. They interviewed me sometimes, when the paper was looking for a neat moral drama. I always tried to speak plainly, avoiding melodrama. It was an odd thing to be both villain and benefactor in different people's timelines. My parents aged. They came to the community center openings sometimes and sat in the back and took photographs of their grandchildren playing. My father's expression held something complicated, pride mixed with a kind of melancholy that can coexist with love. My mother, who had felt the sharpest betrayal, started to bake loaves for community events. She would serve them quietly on long tables and offer them to anyone who asked. One afternoon she pulled me aside and said, softly, "You did something. It hurt, but I see children here I did not see before." Her hands trembled. There was forgiveness not easily offered and not entirely complete, more like an acceptance that the world changes and families adapt. A small reconciliation formed, not the old model of expectations, but a new one where our interactions were governed less by unspoken debts and more by intentional, if cautious, exchanges. Do I regret the method? Sometimes. I regret that my parents worried. I regret that my sister felt cut off from a home that had been the scene of 1,000 small memories. I regret the nights my father lay awake and the way my mother's laugh lost a shade of its old brightness. But I do not regret the principle that people should not be able to take indefinitely under the pretense of family care. I do not regret that the redevelopment gave tangible shelter and opportunities to people who had nowhere else to turn. Moral choices often ask for sacrifices, and these choices are not morally clean. I had to decide what to prioritize, an easy, burdensome familial comfort or a more public good that cost me private friction. The answer I chose required the ledger I had kept to be used as law and the careful cultivation of allies and good intentions. One summer day, at the community fair we hosted to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the center, the crowd smelled of sun and fried dough. Children ran with paper planes, teenagers played a guitar and sang off-key, pottery booths displayed uneven cups, each valuable for the life pressed into their shapes. Sarah's son, my niece, came running across the grass, ice cream on his cheek, a paint-splattered sheet clutched in his hands. He flung himself at me as if I were a harbor. He hugged me ferociously, and for a moment the many arguments and legal pages and rainy council votes fell away. "Thank you, Uncle Armin," he said with a startling candor only children maintain. He did not know the bitter calculus of adult trade-offs, and did not have to. His gratitude was immediate and clean. Zara watched from across the field, expression layered and shifting. She lifted a tentative hand in acknowledgement. I lifted mine. The gesture was small, fragile and true. The ledger I had once used in silence had turned into something public and physical, a center where children learned and elders gathered. When people accused me of cruelty, I listened because cruelty deserves listening. When people thanked me in tearful letters, I kept those notes in the rainy days folder. Sometimes, late at night, I walked the center alone and listened to the echoes in the rooms. I thought of the band poster in my old room with the back scrawled note. To Armin, don't forget your dreams. I had never forgotten them. I had shaped them into a place where other people's dreams might take root. If vengeance can be defined by one final image for me, it is not a triumphant act of spite. It is a slow architecture that transforms private wrongs into public repair. It is not the annihilation of a family, but the reshaping of the ground they once took for granted. I would not claim to be a saint. I would not claim to have acted without selfishness or without pain. But I learned that silence can be an instrument, and when it is turned into action, it must be measured by the good it produces as much as the harm it causes. People ask if I slept at night. I did. Not easily, perhaps, but with the comfort that the project I had set into motion helped people who needed it. I learned that accountability need not be vindictive, it can be constructive. And so, years after the dinner when Zara announced they would be moving into my room, when she smiled that thin smile and the house applauded, the applause had been destined for a different future. A future I took and reshaped so that it did not simply serve their convenience but served a neighborhood. At family gatherings now, conversation sometimes pauses over the center's successes and the children's shows. We still have difficult moments. There are dinners where we avoid the subject like a bruise. But sometimes, in the courtyard where the community center's lights glow soft and warm, my niece runs up with clay on his hands and proffers an uneven bowl. "For you, uncle," he says. He does not care for the legalese, he only cares for the human exchange. I accept the bowl, heavy with the ridges of his fingers, and in that handmade imperfection I find an answer. Repair is possible, messy and incomplete, and sometimes what begins as a ledger of small grievances can end as a place where strangers learn to read together, and where family members, though changed, find small ways back to one another.